The first time I stepped on Stanford's campus, I bent down and I kissed the ground. And I made a vow to myself that I would appreciate being there more than any student who had ever come before me. And I've been back on that campus probably 1,000 times since, and each time I've virtually bent down and kissed the earth in my mind. I was accepted as a graduate student into the geophysics program, and I thought if they knew what my past was, they never would have accepted me. What made me different from every other student was my secret, and I plan to keep it that way for the rest of my life. I have two stories to tell today. One is very personal about my life, and the first one involves my mother, who I've adored all my life. Here she is on one of the best days of her life, marrying a handsome naval officer. She would go on to get a master's degree from Cornell in organic chemistry and pursue a degree a career in cancer research, which she loved. Unfortunately, around the age of 35, she began to show signs of schizophrenia, and she was pregnant with me. She left my father and went to live with her parents, my grandparents. And after about 3 years, my grandparents made the decision with very heavy hearts to commit her to what was then called an insane asylum in Pennsylvania, where we lived. We got to visit her from time to time. She got to visit us on rare occasions. My grandfather would roll a movie camera, and this is one frame from the movie camera showing the affection that my mom and I had for each other. We always had that affection. Somehow, after she was released, she drove an old car across America and ended up in Oakland, California. And she sent a telegram to my parents saying, "Send Christopher." I don't know what what thoughts were running through their head, but at age 7, they loaded me on a TWA jet, and I got to go live with my mom. Unfortunately, her disease progressed, and she became even more terrified of the communists. This was her symptom. She thought the communists were bugging our telephone lines and that they would steal me if they could. And when her disease progressed like that, we lost our apartment, and we began life on the streets of Oakland, and she was too terrified to let me go to school anymore. I knew my mom believed things that weren't necessarily true, but she said a few things. She told me about a truant officer, and if you got caught playing hooky from school, you would go to San Quentin for life if the truant officer caught you. And that sounded like it could be true, and I believed her. So during the day, I stayed completely out of sight, and in the afternoons, she had a heavy smoking habit. I would take a brown paper lunch bag and go out and fill it full of cigarette butts so she could smoke them, because we didn't have enough money to pay for any cigarettes. She claimed that she memorized the complete works of Shakespeare, and she would shout them out as we walked down the streets of Oakland very loudly. And I would drop back almost a block so I could still see her, because she's the only person I knew in life, and I depended on her and I adored her. But it was so embarrassing, and I just couldn't hear any more shouting of Hamlet or whatever. Some years in the future, I was caught shoplifting a sweater and had to go to Oakland's Juvenile Hall. There was a kind man with silver hair who'd visit my cell, and he would bring me books to read. I didn't know how I'd ever get out of there. And he would ask me my name, and I would just go quiet and stare at my feet, and I wouldn't say anything, because shoplifting a sweater was one thing, but going to San Quentin for skipping school was a whole different thing. So he said, "You're going to have to go to court, and the judge is going to demand that you tell him your name." So we went to court, and I think that judge was the most terrifying man I'd ever seen in my life. He sat up high, he dressed in black, he hammered on the desk. He didn't seem nice at all, and eventually we did have to stand. And I started to cry and look down at my feet, and this kind man held me by my shoulders. And when the judge demanded my name, I lost control of my bladder and started screaming. And that's the thing I remember most about Juvenile Hall, is I just couldn't stop screaming. And that's the last thing I remember too, because the next thing that happened is I ended up in the custody of my father and his new wife just across the hills, the Oakland Hills, and living with my sister as well. I'd never met Julie, my new stepmom, before. My sister had lived with my father. I had lived mostly with my mother and grandparents, and I didn't tell anybody anything, of course. So they started me in elementary school, and like the third week of elementary school, and I remember walking into that 6th grade classroom looking at the questions that the teacher was asking and the answers the kids were giving, thinking, I don't understand any of this. And eventually the teacher asked me to come to the board and diagram a sentence. I had no idea what that meant, and I drew a box around it, and the class erupted in laughter. And I did what I always did. I ran. I ran out of the classroom. I ran into the creek. I ran down the creek until I found a storm drain, and I hid in there all day, hoping that the school wouldn't call my dad and tell him what I had just done and that I would get in big trouble. And as I was thinking about it, I was looking at those Oakland hills thinking, you know, I could just walk over those hills and disappear in Oakland and no one would ever find me again, and I could do it. I think I didn't do it because I was afraid that my mom would be heartbroken and terrified if I disappeared, that the communists had finally got me. So I went home, afraid my dad would be mad, and my stepmother, Julie, dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around me while I sobbed, and she didn't ask me anything. It was such a hard thing because my dad was there and my sister was there, and boys are not supposed to cry. Neither are grown men on TED stages supposed to cry. Anyway, the next day in school, they didn't put me back in the classroom. There were some very kind teachers who gave me various different tests. I had to cut paper and predict what the shapes would be when it opened up, and it was a fairly nice day. And a few days later, I didn't know what it meant. My sister said, oh, you were getting an IQ test, and it turns out you have a very low IQ. So they put me in various special learning classes through junior high school and so on. Of course, teachers didn't understand anything because I didn't ever tell anybody anything. But as a freshman in high school, there was a teacher there who had his face badly disfigured from a science teacher had a science experiment gone bad, and the other kids made a lot of fun of him, but he and I bonded. And somehow throughout the course of the year, he convinced me that I could do math and science. I don't know why teachers like that aren't our national heroes. They deserve to be. But no such luck in English, because the English teachers all pulled out Shakespeare. And I just couldn't be there. I found ways to be absent. La la la. I couldn't listen to any more Hamlet or Othello or anything like that. It just brought up all the memories of the streets of Oakland. And so I got D's in English, and my high school counselors couldn't understand why. But they said I could still apply to the UC system because you could take English 1A, non-credit course that we called Bonehead English, and if you passed it, you could stay in the university. So I took it the first quarter, and they brought out Shakespeare, and I got an F, a straight F. So they let me take it the second quarter without me explaining what my problem was, and there was a woman professor, and I got another F. So that brought it down to the third quarter, and they let me take it correspondence, pass or no pass, and I got a no pass. So I was out of the university, and I was humiliated, and I was angry, and I just thought, this is so unfair, and I vowed to myself, I'm never going to step on another college campus as long as I live. So 3 days later, I started a job as a summer camp counselor, a much happier place to be, and I was so shy around girls, I didn't meet any in college, and yet I found myself falling head over heels for this counselor that they hired to run the horse program. And unfortunately, I learned that she had graduated from college with a bachelor's in psychology, and I had just failed in college. I couldn't let her know that. So there were a lot of things I couldn't let people know. But as our relationship progressed through the summer, we began to talk at the end of the summer about meeting each other's parents, and then I was trapped because I had to tell her, like, my dad is mad at me because I failed at, college, and my mom is in a mental institution. What do I tell her? And I told her as little as possible, and yet somehow she stuck with me, and she gently tried to coax me into going back to college, only she could have done that. She offered to tutor me in English. She's sitting right there on the front row, and we got married. And I got accepted to the University of Utah and figured out how to take classes like technical writing where they didn't pull out Shakespeare, and with her help, I sort of got by. And a miracle kind of, to me anyway, happened. There was a visiting speaker who had a PhD in higher education from USC, and he gave a talk called Learning is Delightful. And I sat on the front row, eager to learn. And right in the beginning of that talk, he boomed across the microphone, "The IQ test is the biggest fraud that's ever been perpetrated on the American public. It measures interest and exposure, and that's all it measures." And I thought, wow, he had me at IQ. And then he went on to say, if you will spend 4 hours a day at the same time, same place every day, a place you don't eat or daydream or watch TV, you just learn to focus in that place the same time every day, you will graduate in the top 2% of your class, I promise you. And somehow there were hardships along the way. Poor Tony my wife Tony had to go through another 4 years of supporting me in college, and we had a baby. I had to work 3 a.m. to 8 a.m. United Parcel Service to pay the bills. But somehow I still got accepted to Stanford. And that brings me back to why I told the story in the first place. At Stanford, there was a big donor coming to visit, and they had arranged a banquet in his honor, and had arranged a who's who of speakers there, the president of the university, the soon-to-be Secretary of State, George Shultz, a whole host of industry CEOs, energy company CEOs. And they wanted the concluding speaker to be a student, and they asked me to speak. And I thought I would do anything for Stanford to help promote it. But did that go as far as, for the first time in my life, telling a little bit about my background and why I had this perspective of how much I appreciated the university and how I had this deep belief in the value of higher education because of what had happened? I thought maybe, yeah, I should do that. So I was so nervous before that talk, I had to leave Tony out in the hall in case I bombed. I didn't want to bomb in front of her. And as I started to give the talk, in the first few minutes, the audience went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop, and this is an audience that had been rustling before, and I didn't know what it meant. And it seemed ominous, and I thought, you know, what this could mean is what I'm saying is inappropriate and awkward, and they don't know what to say. And so I had envisioned that possibility, and I pivoted to another kind of talk where I extolled the virtues of the university, and I tried to hide the fact that I had just died inside and was bombing. And then I did what I always did. I wanted to run, but I had Tony there, so I just rushed out of the room, grabbed Tony, and we rushed across the campus. And another CEO who was in the talk rushed faster than me and caught up with us. And I thought, oh no, here goes. But he turned out to be a great mentor. He hired me. He mentored me for 10 years. He bought a company that I helped start with someone else. And then the Dean of Earth Sciences caught up. He was the one who invited me to speak. And he said, that may be the best talk he's ever had a student give. And I thought that was the worst talk that any student had ever given. And that was the first time in my life when I thought, maybe this difference that I have, I thought of myself as so different, maybe it's not a crippling weakness. Maybe it's what actually helped me thrive at Stanford. Maybe it's like a form of superpower. And I thought about the other students, how they stressed over the workload and complained about the professors, and was college even worth it in the first place? And here I was absorbing every second of Stanford and just loving it because of that background that I had. My next story is about working with Steve Jobs. I had a wonderful 10-year career as a geophysicist, wonderful for me, not so wonderful for the family because I had a lot of high-risk travel to do. And in an airport bookstore one time, I ran into this book, The Macintosh Way. It was fascinating. I bought it, I couldn't set it down. Apple had done things like hiring a PhD student in Middle East archaeology to be the product manager for the Macintosh. They assembled all these misfits, and I just thought that was fascinating and wondered if Steve Jobs would hire an earth scientist in his new company, Next Computer. So I took a risk. I moved my family to the Silicon Valley. I applied for a job, and I got it. And then it was like starting 6th grade all over again. When I went in among my colleagues, I couldn't understand a lot of the things they were saying. They were software and hardware engineers, and all kinds of industry lingo and so on. So my confidence was ebbing a little bit, and I got a call from the head of the Unix Expo in New York City, big conference, and he asked if I could get Steve Jobs to keynote at Unix Expo, and he promised an audience of 4,000 people. I didn't know how to follow up on that, so I went to my colleagues and said, what do I do? Do I go up the chain of command? Do I get a hold of Steve's assistant and schedule a meeting? And what do I do to need to prepare? And they said, no, there's nothing like that with Steve. You just go down to that office right there. That's his office. It's glass. He'll see you coming. Stick your head in the door, pop the question out. You'll get a fast answer. And I thought, are they serious? And why are they giving each other these side glances? And why are they not offering to come with me? And a couple of them said, I don't think you'll do it. And it was like, oh, here goes. So with my heart beating a little faster, I popped my head in Steve's office and popped the question. And I got my fast answer. He said, that's insane. I'm not speaking in front of a group of Unix weenies. Go away. And that was my first introduction to Steve. And I walked back to my colleagues, and unfortunately I had to ask them, what is a Unix weenie? And they all erupted in laughter and said, oh, these are the guys that heckle Steve. They think we're evil because we're dumbing down Unix for grandmothers by putting a graphical user interface on it, and it was never intended for that. And I thought, oh, gee, I didn't know that. And so I went home and couldn't sleep, and I'm staring at the ceiling and thought, wait, I'm the only scientist here. There's 350 employees, and among all our developers and everything else, I'm the only Earth scientist. Scientists love Unix. We all love Unix. I've never met the scientist who doesn't love Unix, and we all love graphical user interfaces. These guys are wrong. It's just got to be wrong. Something's wrong with this. But anyway, in the morning, I had to call the head of the Unix Expo and say, he's not going to speak to Unix weenies. And and he graciously said, no, you go back to Steve, because I know that, but we're going to advertise to the Apple community, the Macintosh community in New York City, which is huge, and they're going to line up around the block because Steve is their hero and they want to hear from him. And it's a golden opportunity for Steve to speak to them about the power of Unix. I forgot to say, this whole thing made sense to me because our machines were based on Unix. It seemed to be a natural fit. So that led to a dozen my head in the door, Steve telling me to go away kind of meetings, but I could see behind those intense eyes of his that the gears were beginning to turn. He would say things like, well, we have to fly my presentation desk all the way to New York because it's painted the exact same black as the machine is, and that's really important. And I thought, oh, well, whatever. And that's what led to me being on my hands and knees at the Javits Center on stage with a protractor measuring 28 degrees with a pencil on the stage, because that black desk had to be turned at 28 degrees to the audience because our logo was turned 28 degrees to the vertical, and Steve thought that was really important. The only man in the world who would think that was important. We thought, everybody I knew at Next thought, you know, this guy is over-the-top obsessive about design. Bill Gates is crushing everybody, and he's not obsessed with design. And you know, these other computer manufacturers are just slapping beige paint on their computers, and they're selling a lot of them, and we're not selling very many black computers. This is just sand in the gears. It's Steve's great weakness. He just got to get over it. But what happened next is Apple came and bought Next, and our operating system that Steve had fussed over so much became the core of Mac OS X and drove the renaissance that became Apple. And then they did a big comparison of what we had developed and for this new iPhone that they were coming out with, and made it the core of iOS as well. And we can all see now, everybody can see, that Steve's obsession with design, the only industry executive who cared that much about design, turned out to be his great strength. Look at the Apple stores and the design of AirPods and everything else. It's just amazing what they've become. It became his superpower, which we thought was his debilitating weakness. And the misfits that he hired, people like me and Joanna Hoffman, who was the product manager of the Mac that I referenced, we came from all these different fields. He enjoyed that. He enjoyed having us have a different perspective on life. And I think that's why he embraced the Think Different campaign as thoroughly as he did. When Greta Thunberg came to the US, I thought, uh-oh, she's not in Sweden anymore. And climate science has been heavily politicized in the US, and she's going to get some pretty heavy feedback or pushback. I wonder how she's going to react to that. And what are they going to come after her for? She's too young to know. She's an alarmist. She, you know, is not a scientist. What are they going to come after her for? And some people came after her for being on the autism spectrum, and I cringed and thought, oh no. And she just dismissed it. She said, yeah, that's my difference, and that's my superpower. You know, it took me a decades of connecting the dots in reverse to realize that our differences, often disguised as weaknesses, can actually be our superpowers. Thank you.